That was a wonderful talk, Graham. Thank you very much. And I don't want the group to exhaust you too much more and fire questions at you. So, as a group, it'd be great if we can ask questions to each other as much as to Graham. And I have my own questions, and we'll open up to questions from the audience. But let's just launch with questions from the group to the group. If anyone has something they want to get straight into. And we'll probably have a bit of a Laurel and Hardy comedy show with these two microphones and cables, but go ahead and take that microphone and pass them around.
I'll begin simply, or not simply. I just wanted to make a point that the thing that I thought was I think is most essential about architecture is space, simply. And it seems to me that obviously objects have a role in architecture. We talk about the architectural object, and indeed, to some extent, architects are preoccupied by buildings like the Parthenon and other the house with one wall, things like that. Nevertheless, the other contender for that single most kind of important thing that architecture's about, the object of its preoccupations, is space, and the space that architecture shapes and gives qualities to. And what troubles me then about an ontology of objects is that it seems to me it glides a little bit too quickly over something which is so central to architecture, and it seems to me that actually clearly he recognized space, and it seems to me the question then, if the ontological question is then simply, is space internal to the object, which is, as I understand your fourfold, where you place space. It's an internal relation, or is space an external relation to the object? It seems to me that's, and I think actually architecture could accommodate it either way. I'm not sure that either answer has a direct bearing on architecture. I mean, if you said, no, I insist space is entirely an internal relation, architecture is not going to crumble, But I just think that's one of the points where maybe architecture asks a question to an object-oriented ontology.
For me, space is one of those four tensions.
Yeah.
In this case, it's the tension between real objects and sensual qualities. And as I mentioned, the classic debate is between a space and empty container, which I don't think the Newtonian concept of space, or the purely relational one of Leibniz, where space just means the system of relation between things. I don't think that can be possible, because if everything were purely relational, there wouldn't be different places. It's just a thought experiment. It's a reductio ad absurdum. If everything were purely relational, nothing would be different from everything else.
So you couldn't carve out a space.
Right. So to carve out a space, you need something that's withdrawn from relations. And so space, for me, is precisely that tension between relation and non-relation. So it's a variation on Leibniz's theory, I think. Has architecture crumbled?
No, I don't think it
Does that bring us back to the space-place kind of distinction, where you want to, like a place would be an object in space, so...
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm fine with place instead of space.
Okay. I'll kind of launch in with a thought that's connected to this, which is how various objects relate together as larger groups. I think in your description, often you're defining the object and describing it to us as two objects in relation forming another object. But what happens when it gets more and more complex and objects are part of multiple other objects? They're nested, they're embedded, they come to be hierarchies, structure, and even order. So the Albertian kind of thing about the house and the city having a structural relation. This is a kind of question that's connected to how space is parcelled off, but is it not parcelled off in complex hierarchies of relation?
Yes, and I would say for me, any relation between objects forms a new object. And so you get these compounds that form from the larger and larger objects. And the same object can be part of multiple different objects. So I'm part of the American University in Cairo, I'm part of Edinburgh University Press, and so forth. I'm part of my family. And then there's no problem with that. And sometimes that creates complications because one of those things of which I'm a part can have retroactive vibrations, and another, if American University in Cairo goes bankrupt, my family becomes financially crippled, and so that can happen too. It's also the case, though, that many of the relations of containment, one object and others, that you might think are real might not be. It might be that maybe the house isn't part of the city, or maybe the house is part of the block, and the block is part of the city. You have to look at each example individually, but the fact that you can state that there's a relation between one object and a large object doesn't necessarily mean that it's there. Am I a part of the object called expatriates living in Cairo, or is there really no such real object? And there are criteria for that, but you can never know for sure. The criteria would be that expatriates living in Cairo would have to be something that is not reducible to an aggregate of all individuals, and is also not reducible to its effects. So that would be criteria for figuring out if there really is such a class of people, or as American expatriates living in Cairo, perhaps the real object in question, since we all are on the embassy mailing list. There are lots of objects we can stipulate that are simply not real objects, because they exist only insofar as I stipulate them. So if I say this microphone, the pet dog I had when I was 4 years old, and this bottle of water, well, it's not a very good candidate for objects, but so merely being able to stipulate a compound relation between things is not sufficient. There are criteria that a thing cannot be undermined or overmined.
Would anyone else like to come in on that? Or Jonathan? Okay, go deep.
Well, I wanted to ask a slightly different question.
Sure.
If no one has a point on that one. This is really a question I think I wanted Lorens to ask.
Oh, right.
But I'll ask it anyway, because it's a bit too simple for the kind of questions that I know Lorens normally asks. I think, Graham, you mentioned this point about the unconscious and wanting to think a bit further about whether one could say that objects have an unconscious. And I guess that puzzled me slightly, because I thought, well, surely, how could they, I would rephrase the question, how could they not have an unconscious? In the sense that, what other kind of awareness could objects have of each other than an unconscious one? And I guess I'm kind of taking that from the sort of gradations of consciousness that you were discussing, and taking up the issue I was talking about in relation to tools and the way tools withdraw into a realm of relative unconsciousness, but towards total withdrawal, and imagining that objects are doing something similar to each other. They're having a kind of withdrawal encounter with each other. So they have a kind of awareness, but I can't quite understand how one could call that a conscious awareness, that objects are conscious of each other. So would we therefore have to say they are unconscious of each other?
Part of that is simply that of course, a lot of people are inclined to criticize me as this crazy panpsychist who thinks cotton balls have souls and things. So I always have this kind of default hesitation that I add anytime I'm talking about inanimate objects. So I'm not really sure what I think about the mental life of stones and cotton balls. But I think I would be more inclined to view the experience of stones and cotton balls as a very primitive sort of conscious. It could be unconscious too, but the status of the unconscious is so theoretically sophisticated in someone like Lacan that I want to think a bit more about where that would map onto my ideas. I'm not sure. Is the unconscious simply a very, very primitive, stripped down skeletal form of the conscious or not? I think it's more than that in psychoanalysis. I'm just not sure yet where I would map it, and so I'm trying to be cautious, that's all.
Yeah.
Could I go? I mean, what I think when Graham mentioned whether rocks have an unconscious, you were referring to my paper, and I think what I wrote in it was, and I was a little bit cheeky, really. I said the difference between a human subject and a rock is that a rock doesn't have an unconscious. Okay, and I guess that could be argued. To me, it's pretty obvious that a rock doesn't have an unconscious. But the unconscious is not, the way I understand it, it's not kind of like a kind of minimal consciousness. If you take the volume on consciousness and turn it way, way, way down, you know, and I mean, thinking of it that way, you might say, well, a rock, you know, can't talk to me, but if it has any consciousness, it would be an unconscious. But that isn't what the unconscious is about, really, at least to the extent that I understand psychoanalytic theory. It's something that actually very much depends upon language and communication, because the unconscious is, you know, it's something actually held by others. Okay, my unconscious it's precisely what I don't know about, but what others do know about me in a strange way. It's what my analyst knows about me that I don't know. Okay, and so it fundamentally depends upon having a capacity for symbolization. Okay, it's about signifiers flowing between things, and you know, so I'm just, you know, it seems to me that you know, a human subject is an object, but it's a special kind of object. It's one where an awful lot of communicating goes on, even when you're not aware of it, and that's kind of what the unconscious is. I mean, that's crude, and I'm sure I know there's some Lacanians in the audience who are probably thinking what I said is grotesquely crude, but
actually Freudians and Jungians more, I think.
Freudians and all kinds of views. But anyway, so that's that. It goes back to this whole question about, you know, relational and non-relational worlds. I think so.
If anyone wants to change the subject, bring in a new topic, please go ahead.
Well, could I just come back, partly because you spoke about my paper first, and in a sense it's a kind of a place to start in terms of clearing the decks, like as Heidegger might, setting out to use to build something in his workshop. I thought it was interesting the point you made about certain levels of detail in Heidegger's tool analysis, which you perhaps felt were marginal or not important enough to cloud the kind of the bigger picture, which I'm very sympathetic with, and I'm fascinated with what you then sort of go on to do, you know, as a result of having kind of come through a sort of research career dealing with Heidegger, come out the other side, and come to a kind of ontology of objects. So I don't have a problem with that, with the project at all. It's fascinating. What I find equally fascinating, though, is the kind of how you got there. Because to me, it doesn't quite seem possible to get where you're going from there. You know, that old thing where you ask for directions and they say you can't get there from here. And the point, I guess, still, that I'm kind of coming at this from a kind of a Merleau-Pontian angle, in the sense of having an interest in embodiment and the implications of embodiment in architecture. So that notion of a kind of bodily consciousness, which Merleau-Ponty calls a bodily intentionality, a bodily grasp of things, I think for me is a really important dimension that, again, as you say, is kind of slightly underdeveloped in Heidegger, but it seems to be there, and for me it's important that it suggests a very particular kind of consciousness, a bodily consciousness, which to me doesn't sound like total withdrawal. You know, the tool is relatively withdrawn, or it becomes more so as we learn to use it skillfully. But I hesitate from calling that total withdrawal, because I still think the relationship we have with the tool in use is still of a different sort than the relationship we have with those other objects, those sort of background of objects in the world, life world, or even, you know, the volcano in Iceland or the sandstorm in the desert. To me, those things, I have a very different kind of relationship with the tool that I'm using right now than I do with those other objects, which I may have more interest in on the following day or next year or whenever. So that's why I guess I was concerned with that kind of sense of sort of glossing over or dismissing that level of kind of bodily awareness too quickly, I suppose. Because I think when we get to talk about the way we use buildings, I think a lot of that goes on, a lot of our sort of awareness of architecture, it sort of exists at that level, that kind of non-intellectual, unconscious, bodily grasp of how to get around in space.
I'm glad you brought up Merleau-Ponty. Was that mentioned in your paper? I don't really remember that being an obvious...
Well, briefly, yeah. Maybe too briefly.
Okay. He came off as more Heideggerian than a Merleau-Pontian for some reason, but now more things are making sense. I see. Merleau-Ponty is a philosopher of perception rather than a philosopher of objects and relations, which is how I see myself. And he's really hard to match in terms of the subtleties of perception that he explores. There are a couple of things I'm uncomfortable with in Merleau-Ponty. Partly it's just the fact that I'm trying to go somewhere different, as you suggested. I'm trying to get at the object-object relations, which isn't really something he deals with much. Even though in that course on nature, it's kind of in the same vein as Schelling, where it's nature as opposed to us. It's not nature-nature interactions, which is what I want to. One thing I am uncomfortable with in Merleau-Ponty is he says the house is not the house viewed from nowhere, but it's the house viewed from everywhere, which is a nice line. But for me, the house is not a sum of views. The house is something different from all its views. And so that's a very relational conception of what a house is or what an object is, that it's all the possible views of it added up. Because you add up all the possible views of a house, that's not a house, that's a series of views. It's it's not going to be solid the way a house is, and it's not going to, you're not going to be able to live in a series of views, I don't think. So that's one thing about him. The other thing is that there's always, at any given moment in the history of philosophy, a philosopher or a book that seems the most futuristic. Like, wow, we're not there yet, and if only we can get there, we would be at a different level in philosophy. Merleau-Ponty's The Visible and the Invisible was sort of that when I first started graduate school. Then it became Blanchot. Blanchot never really cashed out. He sort of remained a fringe interest, never became central to philosophy. And now I think it's Laruelle. Everyone said, wow, if only we can understand Laruelle, philosophy would advance a total another step further. And I don't think there's too much there in Laruelle. I like Merleau-Ponty the best of those three, I think. But what bothers me ultimately is this idea of the flesh. He says that the world looks at us just as we look at the world, but still, parts of the world are not looking at each other. It's still a human world dyad. Humans are still half of the world for Merleau-Ponty. And I'm worried about that. I'm worried that he's remaining very much in the Kantian horizon in that way. But you have a point that if I wanted to talk about perception, I wouldn't be able to just say there's a binary difference, because there are all kinds of gradations from unconscious handling of instruments all the way up to full theoretical awareness. I'm not attempting to do that. I'm trying to show that that's not really what's going on in Heidegger. Maybe it is going on in Merleau-Ponty. I think when Heidegger does that, when Heidegger gives detail, he's often just stamping his old threefold onto a concrete subject matter. And this happens a lot in his analysis of everydayness too. There's always three forms of idle chatter, or it's been a while since I read that part of the intent. There's often three forms of just about anything. There's three forms of boredom out there, and there's three forms of, and it becomes a bit monotonous, and you start getting his trick after a while. And I don't think Heidegger ultimately is that good of an analyst of concrete situations. So maybe his stuff on boredom is the best. Merleau-Ponty's better, I think, at concrete situations.
Thank you. Any questions?
Okay, I'm aware that maybe other people who want to pick up on points that already made. But so, Graham, I wanted to sort of raise some sort of thoughts really about your responses to my paper. And I suppose I'm interested really in how you deal with the ecological through Heidegger. And I take some of the sort of critiques around Spinoza. I think to sort of clarify or to bolster my sort of reading of him, I would say it seems to me that he's interesting because he does properly deal with the ecological, and he deals with nature-nature relations. He's not just dealing with Spinoza, sorry. Nature-nature relations. There is this very real attempt, I would say, to move away from human-centric hierarchy. So I think this is where I would say, despite the critique of this univocal substance, that you clearly have an issue with that productivity or possibility of diversity. I would say that it seems to me there is some other sort of aspects that I maybe you would say cash out. So the other point for me to bring him into this debate over the series was the conversation about revision or retrieval of history, the philosophical historic problem, the history of ideas. And so in a way, this is where this came to my comments about working from the 20th century, which I totally accept may be a sort of slightly spurious comment to make, but I think I wanted to just sort of place that there for the whole talk, really, about the potential to go back into pre-Kantian philosophy as well. So, but the thing I also wanted to just bring out a bit was that it seems to me that the conversations around the ecological and the environmental in architectural and today's world can be read very politically. However, you could say there is a reality principle there, which is about the survival of the planet and non-human relations, which it seems to me are more challenging than us saying these are politics of a certain constituency or a certain kind of ideology that perhaps come into that sort of problem of your concern with the historicity of a project over determining the kind of ontological reading. So I wanted to ask you in a way, how do you deal with the ecological? And the other part of that is how do you deal with that with the technology question? And this is my other reason to go back to Spinoza. I think he is actually properly a kind of a technologist in the sense that he is coming out of the rational project. He is critiquing Descartes. He's trying to, he calls Descartes the occult problem of the mind-body split. But I think he is properly dealing with geometry as a kind of science. And yet at the same time, he's not trying to make science this contemporary materialism that we've talked about being, I would agree with you, tends to sort of say there is a solution. We don't need to have philosophy, we've got neuroscience that now makes philosophers redundant, which I think you've mentioned, I've actually had said to me as well, which is quite interesting. When you're told by a neuroscientist that, there's no need for anything but neuroscience. So I was interested in Spinoza because it seems to me he is dealing properly with technologies, and it's a geometric technology, and it certainly has its problems in ethics. But then there's this question about Heidegger, and your point that Heidegger's relation to technology is problematic. And technology and architecture and the built environment, dealing with the environment and ecology, seems to me to be one of the really big questions that architectural practitioners have to deal with. Because at the moment, so much of it is being turned through markets and through just, in a way, very functional, very good object relations in a sort of built environment sense, but actually there's lots of problems with that. And it seems to me that the reason I mentioned the R-ness relation, which I agree can be read very holistically, but I wanted to place it in terms of the distinction to the anthropocene, which many architectural practitioners, it seems to be, using as a way to bring in the technological revolution to deal with human-nature relations. So I suppose I'm just, in the short, I wanted if you could say a little bit about how you engage with environmental or ecological questions. Maybe.
I pick up some pieces as I remember them from your comments. First of all, I totally agree about going back to pre-Kantian philosophy, and this is a large part of my attraction to Whitehead. The fact that he's pretty bold about just saying the main process in reality is a return to 17th century philosophy, which was a great century of philosophy. I do think Kant made that important step forward, which is the finitude, which I just simply project onto all things with believing in human cognition. Again, the problem I have with Ness, I think is a very healthy influence on our ecological awareness, is the idea that human and nature are these two different spheres, that the human sphere should not intrude on the natural sphere. I think that's too radical a split of us from nature. We intervene in nature. We've ruined nature in a lot of ways, but we've also made some improvements to it. I think we've barely begun to see all the ramifications of this problem. 4 years ago, I've told this story on my blog. I saw the most horrifying lecture I ever saw in my life, which was by James Lovelock in Dublin. He's basically saying we're screwed, it's over. We can't do anything about it now. By the year 2100, we'll be down to 1 billion people, so 6 billion of us will be dead. You're going to have to live near the ice caps, or you're going to have to live in New Zealand or Ireland, and the Irish are going to have to shoot people who are trying to get in because they're going to have the perfect climate, and it's just this most apocalyptic lecture possible. Fascinating. I bought a bunch of books at the table afterwards because I was so scared that I thought I better read all this stuff. Then I read a fascinating article in the Atlantic by a friend of mine, Graham Wood, a couple months after that said, actually the problem is it may be too easy to solve global warming, and there were 7 things in there that various people, I don't know about what their credibility level is, were suggesting could reverse global warming. All of them, some of them are just crazy and won't work, I don't think. Like one guy wanted to shoot all these tiny little metallic discs into orbit to reflect sunlight. I can't imagine that would work. But the really scary one that sounded plausible is that you can put up blimps and start spewing out sulfur dioxide from these blimps. Because when Mount Pinatubo erupted in the Philippines in '86, it actually did reverse global warming for 2 years worldwide because sulfur dioxide is so potent at doing this. And so you could do this from a blimp for only like $5 billion a year. You could reverse global warming, but it would totally wipe out the ozone layer and skin cancer would go way up. So the fascinating question was, let's say you could do this. Certain countries would have an interest in doing it, like Bangladesh, like the Netherlands. What if they were going to do this? Would other countries attack them? Because we don't want our skin cancer levels to go up and we don't care if you're flooded. So this could lead to some very good, because it's affordable. It's affordable enough that Bangladesh could do it. Anyway, what got me up from that? It's the idea that...
technology, human
yes.
nature relations.
Yes, that you could say, okay, it's the Anthropocene because we've messed it up. But it might not just be that we mess it up. It might be that the Anthropocene is telling us we can also fix it in some way, which I know that's a dangerous thought to think in some ways, but we also might think about it. We might also be getting to the point where we actually can stop global warming, and so the bigger issue isn't that we're doomed. The bigger issue is what are the politics going to be of how we continue to maintain this balance? What are the politics going to be of who gets to decide what gas to pump into the atmosphere? I suppose we need a world government at that point, right? Just to decide to weigh the benefits of Bangladesh against the benefits of England. We need something better than sovereign invasions of some sort, right? So there's some bigger issues there apart from the doom, from the pessimism and the doom, which is that maybe we're getting to the point where we can control it and can save ourselves, but at very heavy costs. So that was just, I guess, my response to Ness and thinking that I don't like this idea of deep ecology. I think deep ecology has inspired people to do some great things. And I totally support the people, really totally support the people in Istanbul who were defending the park against the mall plan of Erdogan and other such events. So I would want to approach ecology not from saying that there's this nature and it's pristine and it's virgin and it's unspoiled and we humans shouldn't put our grimy hands on it. We have to somehow integrate ourselves into the picture of nature, but I'm borrowing this from Latour a lot. It's not really an original idea, but I think that's the way I would go with it. There was a question you asked before that, though.
I guess I was thinking about the Heidegger problem of technology and how, right, if you come through from the Heidegger position, how does Heidegger and the ecological question come to go?
I'm not sure there are good enough resources there. People have tried it, of course. People have tried to, you can align nature with being, I guess, and say being is what hides and cannot be stockpiled. But what resources does Heidegger really give you to get into the details of technological evolution? You have a guy who thinks that corpses in the gas chamber in Auschwitz are of the same status as mechanized food production. That shows you a problem with his outlook, I think. Because it's such an abstract conception that anything that involves the mass production of anything is equally bad. There's a problem with that, I think.
I think we should quite soon bring in people from the audience, but I just wanted to prompt Adam and Peter to say something before we open it.
Go on, I've nothing to say.
You first.
I've nothing to say. Carry on.
Yeah, no, please.
Okay, I mean, I suppose one thing I'm really interested in with your work is the role of metaphor. If you're really, it seems to me that if you're dealing in inter-object relations, in immediate inter-object relations, that somehow, in that scheme, metaphor isn't much use. I don't know. What's it? Where is metaphor for you?
Well, I think style is very important in philosophy and elsewhere, and not just as an ornament. And I often contrast my views of this with Anglo-American analytic philosophy, which is always insisting on clear writing. You have to write clearly. In other words, the problem with bad writing is that it doesn't get to the point and it's obfuscatory. I've got some problems with that. Here's an example of where it goes wrong. Jerry Fodor wrote an article, I think it was the London Review of Books some years ago, where he said he can't understand why people read Kierkegaard and Nietzsche instead of analytic philosophy, because we're much better writers than the analytic philosophers. How many analytic philosophers are better writers than Kierkegaard? Kierkegaard and Nietzsche are stylistic masters, in most people's eyes. I think what Fodor meant is that we make propositional statements and say that all A is B, and Kierkegaard and Nietzsche just did this fuzzy poetic stuff. I think the issue is not clear writing, the issue is vivid writing. And to be a vivid writer, you often have to be unclear. Just like good painters have to use chiaroscuro and use shadows sometimes. There are times when reality is not clear. And so you should not try to be clearer than reality. Premature clarity, I think, is an intellectual vice. I think this is one of the problems with this school of philosophy. It always attempts premature clarity. It doesn't let things be obscure when they're obscure. A lot of things are obscure in this world. Use of metaphor. Well, I think it goes without saying that metaphor is one of the most powerful forms of language we have, and it often makes things clearer than direct propositional statements, which is what the analytic philosophers always demand of us. In fact, anytime they use a metaphor, they always add so to speak, or as it were, as if they were embarrassed by using a metaphor. I don't think you should be embarrassed. I think you should try to produce more of these. Aristotle said it's the greatest gift. Metaphor is the greatest gift. It cannot be taught. It's a kind of genius. You have to be born with it because it allows you to see the resemblances that other people don't see. I agree with that. How you would use this to describe interactions? Well, I'm not saying that poetry should replace physics. I think that for purposes of physics, mathematization, formalization of the interactions is useful. I don't think it gives us the reality of electrons or atoms, but that doesn't matter. It might be enough. Management techniques and accounting also don't give us the reality of the things that they discuss, but they formalize things in a useful way that allows us to predict things. And so in a certain sense, philosophy has to not try too hard to be useful. It does end up being useful in certain ways. But in a sense, it's a counter movement to usefulness. It's trying to deal with things not insofar as they are handy for other people, but insofar as they're possibly not handy at all, insofar as they're deeper than any possible use of them. I mean, hopefully that's not the case. Hopefully philosophy ends up being useful to architecture, as to literature, as to physics. Actually, I would say this. Scientists seem to have the top scientists often have a hunger for philosophy that you don't see in scientifically inclined philosophers. I've written this long critique of these philosophers, Ladyman and Ross. Ladyman's at Bristol, Ross is in Alabama somewhere. And they've written this book that says in the preface, we should simply defer to science on all philosophical questions. The metaphysics of space and time should be done by relativity physicists. The metaphysics of whole and part should be done by quantum theorists. But that's not what you get if you go to the top scientists. That is a post-war American phenomenon. It's people like Feynman who said, oh, this philosophy is just a bunch of nonsense, you can just do this. The German physicists never thought like this. They were always very philosophically educated. Einstein was fascinated by philosophy. Bohr was very inspired by Kierkegaard. So there is that older tradition in physics where philosophy was vitally important, and we've got now some authors such as Wallace who say that physics has reached such an impasse that we need philosophy more than ever. Carlo Rovelli said in a famous interview that he's tired of philosophers trying to limp along after physics and simply comment on what physics is doing. He wants us to jump ahead. And Ladyman was asked about that in an interview in Collapse, and he said, well, of course there are some philosophers who are capable of working at the cutting edge of physics, and they should continue to do so. But that's not what Rovelli said. Rovelli said he wants philosophers to work beyond the cutting edge of physics, which for someone like people like Ladyman and Ross, or perhaps even Richard Feynman, is nonsense, right? Philosophers are supposed to simply be commenting. Oh, you also mentioned neuroscientists. That's what I forgot to answer in your question. This brings me to that. Thomas Metzinger is a great example of this. He says we need an interdisciplinary approach. What he really means is that we need a scientific approach, and philosophy is going to be a slave of neuroscience. And he interviewed, in his shorter book, The Ego Tunnel, he interviews this guy, Wolfsinger, and Wolfsinger says, well, we still are going to need philosophers. And you think this is a major concession. But then it turns out we need philosophers to sit on ethics panels, because neurophilosophy, which is going to solve the problems, is still going to leave some dangerous ethical issues that philosophers will need to answer. So we've got this tiny little role left. We can't talk about the world anymore, but we can be ethics panelists, that's important too, of course. I used to chair the IRB at my university, and ethics is very important in scientific research, but I think we can do a lot better than that, than just sitting on ethics panels.
Peter?
All right. here, we got two of these. Just like we have two tables. They're fantastic tables.
Where's the third microphone?
Yeah, exactly. One of the reasons that I presented my thing the way I did, i.e. entirely as the talk, was because I was trying to avoid decanting it all into a text. And this business of how to do, we've actually talked very little about architecture today, and one of the questions that I've been struggling with in teaching is this business of architecture always, I mean, ever since the post-war period, borrowing discourses from art history, physics, biology, engineering. Everybody else had a credible discipline but architecture. And as a result of that exercise, the business of quite what is in play and the degree, I actually think the Merleau-Ponty, for example, is about the claims on us rather than our perception of them. We can go into that another day. It's quite a messy world, and that therefore the business of trying to reconcile something. I'm quite, in some ways, I'm very admiring of what you're doing, but I have a very difficult time reconciling with a world in which architecture happens, in which we're part of it, in which, I've spent years getting rid of space. I think it's one of those generalizations that flattens architecture to, form. And what Schumacher is mainly about is, a form generation operation. And the rhetoric that goes along with it is almost entirely metaphorical. And of course, all language is metaphorical, blah. And so I find myself sitting here saying, really, we, as you said, we should start somewhere else if architecture is the topic, or I'm perfectly happy to let this ontology discussion go on, but the communication between them, it seems to me, if it doesn't acknowledge the different spectra, or different levels at which it happens, for us, for objects, for sub-objects, if it doesn't acknowledge the fact that it happens with, I know you dislike practice, or you made some very vile comment about practice, but this is actually something I've gotten quite interested in, and that's how I ended up finding out about you through the Wolf and the Prince. But at any rate, I'll stop there, because otherwise this is not really about me.
Okay. I actually don't despise practice at all. I was just saying I don't think it's as different from theory as some people think. If you're looking at ontology, you need to talk about a level of reality that's deeper than theory and practice. I think practice is perfectly respectable. I just don't see it as being this fount of ontological innovation that some people think it is in Heidegger. I think that objects are deeper than theory and practice. Jumping back to your first point, we don't actually have to leave it for another topic about Merleau-Ponty, because I agree with you. I agree with you that Merleau-Ponty is about the claim that things make on us rather than our perception. I didn't mean to make it sound as subjective as I made it sound. Because for Merleau-Ponty, for example, there's a correct way to look at something to perceive it the right way. So the thing is demanding that we look at it. Normally, for example, Merleau-Ponty says we don't look at things right side up. We're seeing things leaning over, but we correct that because it's an imperative structure. It's how we perceive things. My own MA advisor, Alfonso Lingus, who was very influenced by Merleau-Ponty, pushes this even further and says that there's an ethical imperative in inanimate objects. If you have an expensive chocolate, it's ethically wrong to just wolf it down as though it were cheap. Or if you have a very expensive champagne, you can't just guzzle it like Kool-Aid. You have to actually savor it and have it at the right time and at the right occasion. And it may be debatable, but it's fascinating, this idea that things emanate an ethical imperative to us just like animals and humans. As for how this applies to architecture, again, I'm going to leave that more to the architects. All I know is that a number of people in architecture are finding a use for this, and I'm still learning what use they find for this. And I admit that they're probably in part reacting against the opposite tendency of over-relationizing things, but that's how intellectual life always works. Something goes too far, and somebody pulls out an opposite tendency, and I'll be passé someday too, and there'll be some neo-relational theory of architecture that looks at me as an enemy or something. That's how the world works. But people seem to be finding a use for it just as they're finding use for it in the visual arts, and I don't want to lecture people about how to do it. I'm going to sit back and watch and maybe offer a word here and there when I think something's being completely misunderstood that I said, but I'm not going to worry too much about being misunderstood. Many misunderstandings are productive.
Maybe I think we should open up to the audience. There's a question over here to the left. My left. Your right.
You've more or less answered my question already. I was going to ask you, I'm coming from an art background, and you made these very interesting points. I'm coming from an art background, a Lacanian psychoanalytic background and an art background. And you made this very interesting point about what you did for Documenta around art and poetry.
Right.
And I just wondered, you separated politics and art, and you separated ethics and at least politics and ontology, and ethics and ontology. And I understand that you don't want to put your numerology to use in a kind of restrictive way. But at the same time, I'm very interested what the ethical destiny of your numerology might be. And I'm thinking of, say, Lacan's ethics, for example, the topology of Lacan's ethics, and the way sublimation plays a part in that, and the way ontology, his ontology of the little object A, for example, comes to be folded into relations and signification. And I just wondered if you could say something about your topology of art in relation to your numerology. How this withdrawn ontological place in the object comes to be folded into the work of art that circulates in relations. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think maybe I'll start with the ethics part, because I understood that better, I think. I was trying to say that no politics follows directly from an ontology, so I guess I should say that no ethics follows directly from an ontology either. I have certain things that I think follow ethically from my philosophy, but I'm not sure whether they're just temperamental inclinations. For example, I like letting stuff be. I like not interfering in stuff too much. And that seems to fit in some way with my idea that things have a reality that is different from their appearance, and I shouldn't then try to claim that I know. I try not to pressure people to make certain decisions and things like this, because I feel like they have a deep character that I can understand.
Do you think it's emancipatory?
It's a what?
Do you think it has an emancipatory effect?
It might not in all cases.
These supplements of excess.
It might not. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that until you asked it. I always thought it was good not to be bossy and not to tell people what they should do. Maybe that's harmful to them. Maybe I should be ordering people around more often. I don't know, but
I'm not talking about you ordering people around. I'm
yes.
talking about this kind of ontological status of the object and an encounter with it. Does that have an emancipatory effect? That it makes a claim on you and it opens you up to an outside?
In a way, yes, and here I would refer to Lingus again, because there is a certain ethical component to our interactions with other things. That there is a certain right way to enjoy a certain city. There's a certain temple and a certain. There are forms of behavior we know are inappropriate or appropriate for certain situations, even when other people are around. It's not just something that has to do with people. But, I like some of Lingus's examples. It's wrong to go in the temple in Kyoto with a Walkman on your head listening to top 40 music. It's somehow ethically wrong. I think there's something to that you have to open yourself to the experience and not... I know somebody who was criticized once for always bringing their environment with them. I think that's the kind of thing I would want to avoid, always bringing my environment with me. You have to open yourself to the environment you're in and do as the Romans do, I suppose. I think another implication here for ethics. This already occurs in Heidegger, the fact that he's moving away from a rule-based ethics. Heidegger doesn't think there should be ethical rules that everyone must follow. There's a component of authenticity there. The extent to which I agree with that is that I think we are not all judged by the same standards, nor should we all be judged by the same standards. And my way of formulating this is that we all get away with certain things that other people don't get away with. And if you want to really know who somebody is, ask what they're getting away with that anybody else will be punished for. And I first thought of this because I had a colleague who said the most outrageous things in class that I would have been fired for immediately. And I started asking myself, how does he get away with this? Well, I think it's because he projects some sort of crazy uncle persona, and people enjoy this from him, and they wouldn't enjoy it from me. For me, it would seem predatory or aggressive or out of character somehow. But I think for each person, you can find a few things they do that no one else can do and get away with it. And so it's a kind of character-based ethics, I guess, rather than a role-based one. So that's another possible implication. You asked about artworks.
Oh, yes. I mean, what I'm hearing you say from a psychometric point of view is that you're talking about a kind of the kind of singularity of a kind of jouissance.
Yeah, that's right.
Which would be the coordinates of a certain kind of psychical object. And it's another question, what is the relationship between the psychical object in, say, a kind of topology and your immunology? Because it sounds like you're talking about certain kinds of jouissances that make somebody singular.
I may be, and Levi Bryant, who has a psychoanalytic background in a way that I don't, has mentioned this a lot on his blog, Larval Subjects, where he's talking about how ultimately there's a certain kind of jouissance that makes people prefer a certain kind of philosophy to another, and you get to a point where you can't argue with them. And Nietzsche already said something like this. So, for example, there are certain reductionistic philosophers who like debunking other people's religions and debunking their belief in tooth fairies and anything larger than atoms. And I just find this completely unappealing. This idea that you're going around beating up reactionaries and bursting people's balloons. That's what I associate reductionism with. To me, it seems completely unliberatory. But there might be other people. I mean, if I start giving psychoanalytic explanations for it, it will sound like I'm asymmetrically explaining their philosophies away without explaining mine. But there are certain people where I wonder, what sort of background did they come from? They would simply want to debunk everything they encounter and show that it's meaningless and zero. I guess there's some kind of personality structure there that I simply can't relate to. I try arguing with them, but you really can't at some point. They're not going to listen. There's certain sadomasochism in some philosophies that I don't understand. They want to destroy things and want to be destroyed. Certain people like beating up other people in arguments and being beaten up in arguments. There's certain subcultures in philosophy where that's how you do business. You're beating each other up in arguments and they seem to think it's fun. Like boxing at the gym. I just don't get that. But yes, right, there's a certain kernel that you can't really explain. Philosophy ultimately reaches a level that's not quite rational, that has to do with personality, with jouissance, in the way that you said.
Any other questions? Preferably someone that could help us bring architecture and ontology together.
Can I ask you something about
architecture? Please do.
Yeah. Oh, right. Just one question.
Yeah.
Two.
Yeah, one.
Thank you, Graham, for the lecture. Just a point of clarification, really. I just wanted to know, you mentioned the ship of Theseus,
yes.
and it's something that has a parallel to architecture, and really to do with conservation and preservation of buildings, and this idea of authenticity,
Yes.
and how identity perseveres through time. And I suppose I just really wanted to know, in your view, how or do objects actually persevere through 2 moments of time?
I'm torn about that question, and there are a couple of practical examples that really move me. The first was when I went to Florence for the first time, and I was so excited to go into Dante's house. I'm in Dante's house, and then I read it was a 19th century reconstruction on the same site. So I had to admit that I was disappointed. Of course, there's the Globe Theatre here in London, but it's not like being in Shakespeare's original theatre, but it's still inspiring in some way. Then there's Stax Records in Memphis. A lot of my favorite early American 1950s, 1960s musicians recorded on the Stax label. And he was always writing in Booker T and the MGs. And the first time I went there with my friend from Memphis, it was just simply a vacant lot, and we were outraged. And he was driving down the street 2 years later with his mother and was complaining about this. And his mother said, "You mean this building?" And she pointed, and there it was, reconstructed. He hadn't done this. So these Stax Records was there again. It's not the same thing, and it is the same thing, right? I'm not sure I can shed much light on that. But I'm inclined to think the material doesn't matter as much as the form. That's my prejudice, I guess. So I'm sympathetic to the Japanese attitude here. I think that you can reconstruct the shrine with better wood. I don't think the actual physical wood needs to be the same, but I'm inclined to think that if you have the same form of a thing in the same place, it's more or less. Of course, then that opens you up to the danger of what if a dead pet can be reconstructed with the DNA, as some people are doing. What would I think about bringing back my childhood dog by impregnating some of the dog with the DNA? This can be done now. You clone your dead pets. There'd be something a bit creepy about that, wouldn't there? When you get to living things. So that's not really an answer, but maybe it sheds some light on how I'll attack the problem.
There's a question at the back there.
Well, first of all, I just want to thank you very much. It's been immensely enjoyable to listen. It's been immensely enjoyable to listen to you talk.
Thank you.
It's really a pleasure. When I was listening to you, I was just thinking a little bit about Michel Foucault, one of the names that you didn't mention. And I was thinking that the early Foucault could be accused of overmining,
Yes.
and the late Foucault could be accused of undermining. But Foucault's response possibly could be, well, he's actually offering, his words, a toolkit which is an ethical engagement. And I was just wondering about this toolkit as opposed to the ready to hand. Because I think the toolkit is perhaps more politically interesting in our ecological discussion, and perhaps can take us slightly further than this ready to hand.
Yeah, that's very interesting. First of all, in what sense would the late Foucault be undermining? I can see how the early Foucault was overmining Foucault.
The late Foucault, in terms of the kind of the return to Nietzsche, this energy, the sense that we can continue to construct ourselves in different ways. The idea that it's not about discovering you could continually recreate yourselves in different kind of ways. That you're not fixed in any particular way. It's not about discovering who your essence is. It's about the possibilities of what you can become.
I think I'd still call it overmining, but I see your point. Yes, undermining and overmining are both an important part of any toolkit, and I tried to give an example of why they're very useful. So it's very useful both to show that something is a mere surface and what's really going on is deeper, and it's also important to do the opposite sometimes and say there isn't anything deeper there, it's merely a play of surfaces. But I don't think philosophy is just a toolkit, and that's the core of my response. That every intellectual field needs methods, and in a sense philosophy is a counter-method. A method is a way of oversimplifying things. A method is a way of getting a more or less accurate ballpark guess by oversimplifying things, and any method you can think of does this. So universities will reward their professors by who's published the most. Well, of course, some people publish a lot and it's crap, and other people publish a few brilliant things. But it's not a bad ballpark method when some state universities in America at least say we're going to pay you by how many publications you have in our free journals. It's a method. What are some other methods? Pretty much anyone you can think of is a way of oversimplifying the material in a way that picks out certain things in a fairly accurate way while oversimplifying them. So I would agree that that's necessary for a toolkit, but I think if you're using a toolkit, it's not a good ontology. Ontology or philosophy is a counter toolkit. It's not just an instrument, it's an anti-instrument. It's trying to get at that which is non-instrumental, that which works beneath or above the instrumental, overmining and undermining.
What I'm struggling with, it's almost as if you're turning your ontology into an ethics, which you say you're not, but it does seem to be pushing in that direction.
Only in the sense that there's an intellectual imperative not to overmine or undermine. Philosophy, a love of wisdom, I guess if you look at love in ethical terms, you should be trying to go towards that unknowable thing. And that's the imperative. There is an ethical core in that sense. And you should be trying to get into the thing that's not reducible downwards or upwards. That's what philosophers are supposed to do in order to do their job well, in my opinion.
I just want to use the last, I think we should wrap up, and I want to use the last word to Adam, seeing as he was going to bring us home to architecture as advertised.
Gosh, that's a bit. I suppose I wanted to talk about this strange idea of the so-called post-critical, which became fashionable in American schools of architecture, at least some of them in the mid-2000s. And it seems to have come about by, from practitioners who were hired to university chairs, but scared by philosophy and theory, and seeking somehow to kind of intellectualise a certain sort of anti-intellectualism. Going back to talking about diagramming form and daylighting, etc., as being the only discourses in architecture. And as your philosophy becomes more well known in architecture, as I suspect it will, I wonder if there's a danger, or maybe, there's the possibility that it might become claimed for a certain kind of anti-intellectualism. And that worries me, but I wonder whether it worries you.
I think that's only the case if you view the intellect's job as being one of overmining or undermining. So in other words, that you have to be able to make clear discursive propositions about things in order to know them. That's what critique usually means, that you're debunking. You're saying that religion and alchemy are false because of these rational grounds. But there's another sense of critique that includes what I talked about when I mentioned wine criticism. That's a kind of critique that doesn't think it can debunk. It's doing the opposite movement. Wine criticism is realizing there's something about the flavor of the wine that can only be talked about in this poetic and admittedly sometimes pretentious language. Anything can be made pretentious in the wrong hands. Art criticism, literary criticism. You can't. I have a friend, Michael Whitmore, who's the director of the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, who does very interesting things with quantitative computer analysis. Like he'll go through and find out. He'll count the number of certain verb structures in each of Shakespeare's plays. And this will lead him to interesting hypotheses, like which one is it? I think Othello actually has the grammatical structure more typical of Shakespeare's comedies rather than of the tragedies, so that makes it the oddball. He found this out on the computer. So that's fascinating. But you can't over-quantify Shakespeare and get anything out of Shakespeare. The political science has already been over-quantified. Many disciplines have already been over-quantified. That's what people usually mean when they mean critique, that we're going to cut all the crap and we're going to measure stuff in the way that scientists do, because scientists are the serious, hardcore thinkers, and everyone else is just artsy-fartsy and slithering towards the truth and never getting there. I don't see that way. I think the real senses of criticism are art criticism, food criticism, wine criticism, literary criticism, architecture criticism, where you're never going to be able to say exactly what it is you're trying to say, where there's never going to be a correct answer. So I don't think it's anti-intellectual at all. It's just a different kind of intellectual life. That's what I would say to that.
And so we haven't been able to say what we want. Oh, sorry.
I just wanted to say a word.
Oh, yeah.
You were in the middle of it.
I was going to wrap it up. So.
Right. Okay. Well, no, I just following Adam's thoughts on, on trying to bring this to architecture, because I'm very aware that this was supposed to be architecture confronting ontology, and I don't think we've really done that. And so just to be very quick about this, I think that if there's something that architecture can take from object-oriented ontology, from your thought in particular, it would be something about the poetics of objects. I mean, architecture is a kind of a poetic practice, and I mean, Heidegger talks about the necessity of dwelling poetically, and I mean, architecture already has a poetics of objects. You can look at Piranesi's prints, you can look at the Corb's encounter with the Parthenon, you can look at all sorts of things, and this would be simply to say, well, listen, how can other discourses, like an ontology of an object-oriented ontology, add to that poetics? How can it kind of make the object realer, like in the way that it seems the glittering world of objects is incredibly real in Greek tragedy, and this kind of incredible realism. So
I think that's a great note to end on. Unless you want to come back on it.
One second. Just that I think that's a question for architects to answer. I can't legislate how triple will be applied to any particular area. It would be arrogant, and also I wouldn't know what I was doing. So I trust architects to try to. Maybe it'll turn out that people say there's nothing new here. This is old hat. We've done this before, and then I move on. But it seems like people are taking more interest in that. So I hope that dialogue continues.
Yeah, I think it's a great end on a kind of opening up to the future and a challenge to answer the questions that we can answer. So I'd like to thank everybody. It's been a wonderful series, and thank you very much to all of you.